Chapter 3, Part 1 of American Men of Action by Burton Egbert Stevenson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. Washington to Lincoln, Part 1. Near the left bank of the Potomac River, in the northwestern part of Westmoreland County, Virginia, there stood, in the year 1732, a little cabin, where lived a planter by the name of Augustine Washington. It was a lonely spot, for the nearest neighbor was miles away, but the little family, consisting of father, mother, and two boys, Lawrence and Augustine, were kept busy enough wresting a living from the soil. Here, on the 22nd day of February, a third son was born, and in due time christened George. Just a century had elapsed since John Smith had died in London, but in that time the colony which he had founded, and which had been more than once so near extinction, had grown to be the greatest in America. 500,000 people were settled along her bays and rivers, engaged, for the most part, in the culture of tobacco, for which the colony had long been famous, and which was the basis of her wealth. Her boundaries were still indefinite, for though, by the King's charter, the colony was supposed to stretch clear across the continent to the Pacific, the country beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains was still a wilderness, where the Indian and the wild beast held undisputed sway. Even in Virginia proper, there were few towns and no cities, Williamsburg, the capital, having less than 200 houses, but each planter lived on his own estate, very much after the fashion of the feudal lords of the Middle Ages, generous, hospitable, and kind-hearted, fond of the creature comforts, proud of his women and of his horses, and satisfied with himself. It was into this world that George Washington was born. While he was still a baby, his father moved to a place he purchased on the banks of the Rappahannock, opposite Fredericksburg, and here the boy's childhood was spent. His father died when he was only 11 years old, but his mother was a vigorous and capable woman, from whom her son inherited not a little of his sturdy character. He developed into a tall, strong, athletic youth, and many stories are told of his prowess. He could jump 20 feet. On one occasion he threw a stone across the Rappahannock, and on another, standing beneath the famous Natural Bridge, threw a stone against its great arch, 200 feet above his head. He grew to be over 6 feet in height, and finely proportioned; altogether a handsome and capable fellow, who soon commanded respect. At that time, surveying was a very important occupation, since so much of the colony remained to be laid out, and George began to study to be a surveyor, an occupation which appealed to him, especially because it was of the open air. He was soon to get a very important commission. When Augustine Washington died, he bequeathed to his elder son, Lawrence, an estate on the Potomac called Hunting Creek. Near by lay the magnificent estate of Belvoir, owned by the wealthy William Fairfax, and Lawrence Washington had the good fortune to win the heart and hand of Fairfax's daughter. With the money his bride brought him, he was able to build for himself a very handsome dwelling on his estate, whose name he changed to Mount Vernon, in honor of the English admiral with whom he had seen some service. George, of course, was a frequent visitor at Belvoir, meeting other members of the Fairfax family, among them Thomas, sixth Lord Fairfax, who finally engaged him to survey a great estate which had been granted him by the king on the slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains. George Washington was only 16 years of age when he started out on this errand into what was then the wilderness. It was a tremendous task which he had undertaken, for the estate comprised nearly a fifth of the present state, but he did it so well that, on Lord Fairfax's recommendation, he was at once appointed a public surveyor, and may fairly be said to have commenced his public career. His brother soon afterwards secured for him the appointment as adjutant general for the district in which he lived, so that it became his duty to attend to the organization and equipment of the district militia. This was the beginning of his military service, and of his study of military science. He was at that time 18 years of age. This was the end of his boyhood. You will notice that I have said nothing about his being a marvel of goodness or of wisdom, nothing, for instance, about a cherry tree. That fable, and 100 others like it, were the invention of a man who wrote a life of Washington half a century after his death, and who managed so to enwrap him with disguises that it is only recently we have been able to strip them all away and see the man as he really was. Washington's boyhood was much like any other. He was a strong, vigorous, manly fellow. He got into scrapes, just as any healthy boy does. He grew up straight and handsome, ready to play his part in the world, and he was called upon to play it much earlier than most boys are. We shall see what account he gave of himself. When George was 20 years old, his brother Lawrence died and made him his executor. From that time forward, Mount Vernon was his home, and in the end passed into his possession. But he was not long to enjoy the pleasant life there, for a year later he was called upon to perform an important and hazardous mission. We have seen how La Salle dreamt of a great French empire, stretching from the Great Lakes to the mouth of the Mississippi. This was already becoming a reality, for the governor of Canada had sent troops to occupy the Ohio Valley and to build such forts as might be needed to hold it. This was bringing the French altogether too close for comfort. As long as they were content to remain in the Illinois country, nothing much was thought of it, for that was far away. But here they were now right at Virginia's back door, and there was no telling when they would try to force it open and enter. So Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia determined to dispatch a commissioner to the officer in command of the French, to summon him to leave English territory. The commissioner was also to try to kill two birds with one stone, and form an alliance with the Indians, so that, if it came to fighting, the Indians would be with the English. No more delicate and dangerous mission could well be conceived, and after careful consideration, the governor selected George Washington to undertake it. On October 30, 1753, Washington left Williamsburg, with a journey of more than 1,000 miles before him. How that journey was accomplished, what perils he faced, what difficulties he overcame, how, on more than one occasion, his life hung by a thread, all this he has told, briefly and modestly, in the journal which he kept of the expedition. 3 months from the time he started, he was back again in Williamsburg, having faced his first great responsibility and done his work absolutely well. He had shown a cool courage that nothing could shake, a fine patience, and a penetration and perception which nothing could escape. He was the hero of the hour in the little Virginia capital. The whole colony perceived that here was a man to be depended upon. He had found the French very active along the Ohio, preparing to build forts and hold the country, and laughing at Dinwiddie's summons to vacate it. This news caused Virginia to put a military force in the field at once, and dispatch it to the west, with Washington in virtual command. It was hoped to build a strong fort at the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, which would prevent the French from getting to the Ohio, since all travel in that wilderness must be by water. On May 28, 1754, while hastening forward to secure this position, Washington's little force encountered a party of French, and the first shots were exchanged of the great contest which, 12 years later, was to result in the expulsion of the French from the continent. It was Washington who gave the word to fire, little foreseeing what history he was making. "I heard the bullets whistle," he wrote home to his mother, "and believe me, there is something charming in the sound," a bit of bravado which shows that Washington had not yet quite outgrown his boyhood. No doubt the bullets sounded much less charmingly 5 weeks later, when he and his men, brought to bay in a rude fortification which he named Fort Necessity, were surrounded by a superior force of French and Indians, and, after an all day fight, compelled to surrender. It is worth remarking that this bitter defeat, the first reverse which Washington suffered, occurred on the 3rd day of July, 1754. 21 years from that day he was to draw his sword at the head of an American army. Washington made his way back to Virginia with the news of his failure. The French had occupied the vantage ground he was aiming at, and at once proceeded to erect a fort there, which they named Duquesne. Aid was asked from England to repel these invaders, and early in 1755 a great force, under Major General Edward Braddock, advanced against the enemy. Washington served as aide de camp to the general, whose ideas of warfare had been gained on the battlefields of Europe, and who could not understand that these ideas did not apply to warfare in a wilderness. In consequence, when only a few miles from the fort, he was attacked by a force of French and Indians, his army all but annihilated, and he himself wounded so severely that he died a few days later. During that fierce battle, Washington seemed to bear a charmed life. 4 bullets tore through his coat and 2 horses were shot under him, but he received not a scratch, and did effective work in rallying the Virginia militia to cover the retreat. 3 years later, he had the satisfaction of marching into Fort Duquesne with an English force which banished the French for all time from the valley of the Ohio. That victory ended the war for a time, and Washington returned to Virginia to marry a charming and wealthy widow, Mrs. Martha Custis, and to take the seat in the House of Burgesses, to which he had just been elected. He served there for 15 years, living the life of the typical Virginia planter on his estate of Mount Vernon, which had passed into his possession through the death of his brother's only child. He had become one of the most important men of the colony, whose opinion was respected and whose influence was very great. During all this period, the feeling against England was growing more and more bitter. Let us be candid about it. The expulsion of the French from the continent had freed the colonies from the danger of French aggression and from the feeling that they needed the aid of the mother country. That they should have been taxed to help defray the great expense of this war against the French seems reasonable enough. But there happened to be in power in England at the time a few obstinate and bull headed statesmen serving under an obstinate and ignorant king, and they handled the question of taxation with so little tact and delicacy that, among them, they managed to rouse the anger of the colonies to the boiling point. For the colonists, let us remember, were of the same obstinate and bull headed stock, and it was soon evident that the only way to settle the difference was to fight it out. But the impartial historian must write it down that the colonies had much more to thank England for than to complain about, and that at first the idea of a war for independence was not a popular one. As it went on, and the Tories were run out of the country, or won over, as battle and bloodshed aroused men's passions, then it gradually gained ground. But throughout the members of the Continental Congress, led by John and Samuel Adams, were ahead of public opinion. As we have said, it soon became apparent that there was going to be a fight, and independent companies were formed all over Virginia, and started industriously to drilling. Washington, by this time the most conspicuous man in the colony, was chosen commander in chief, and when, at the gathering of the Second Continental Congress at Philadelphia, came news of the fight at Lexington and Concord, the army before Boston was formally adopted by the Congress as an American army, and Washington was unanimously chosen to command it. I wonder if any one foresaw that day, even in the dimmest fashion, why immortality of fame was to come to that tall, quiet, dignified man. That was on the 15th day of June, 1775, and Washington left immediately for Boston to take command of the American forces. All along the route the people turned out to welcome him and bid him Godspeed. Delegations escorted him from one town to the next, and at last, on the afternoon of July 2d, he rode into Cambridge, where the next day, in the shadow of a great elm on Cambridge Common, he took command of his army and began the 6-year struggle which resulted in the establishment of the independence of the United States of America. His first task was to drive the British from Boston, and he had accomplished it by the following March. Then came a long period of reverses and disappointments, during which his little army, outnumbered but not outgeneraled, was driven from Long Island, from New York, and finally across New Jersey, taking refuge on the south bank of the Delaware. There he gathered it together, and on Christmas night, 1776, while the enemy were feasting and celebrating in their quarters at Trenton, he ferried his army back across the ice-blocked river, fell upon the British, administered a stinging defeat, and never paused until he had driven them from New Jersey. That brilliant campaign effectually stifled the opposition which he had had to fight in the Congress, and resulted in his being given full power over the army and over all parts of the country which the army occupied. One more terrible ordeal awaited him. The winter of 1777 spent at Valley Forge, where the army, without the merest necessities of life, melted away from desertion and disease, until at one time it consisted of less than 2,000 effective men. The next spring saw the turning point, for France allied herself with the United States. The British were forced to evacuate Philadelphia, and were driven back across New Jersey to New York, and finally, by one of the most brilliant marches in history, Washington transferred his whole army from the Hudson to the Potomac, and trapped Cornwallis and his army of 7,000 men at Yorktown. Cornwallis tried desperately to free himself, but to no avail, and on October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire force. There is a pretty legend that, as Cornwallis delivered up his sword, a cheer started through the American lines, but that Washington stilled it on the instant, remarking, "Let posterity cheer for us." Whether the legend be true or not, posterity has cheered, for that brilliant victory really ended the war, although 2 years passed before peace was declared, and the independence of the United States acknowledged by the King of England. Long before this, everybody knew what the end would be, and there was much discussion as to how the new country should be governed. A great many people were dissatisfied with the Congress, and it was suggested to Washington that there would be a more stable government if he would consent himself to be king, or dictator, or whatever title he might wish, and that the army, which had won the independence of the country, would support him. Washington's response was prompt and decisive. "Let me conjure you," he wrote, "if you have any regard for your country, concern for yourself, or respect for me, to banish these thoughts from your mind, and never communicate, as from yourself or any one else, a sentiment of like nature." It was perhaps the first time in the history of the world that men had witnessed the like. Soon afterwards, the army was disbanded, and Washington, proceeding to Annapolis, where the Congress was in session, resigned his commission as commander in chief. There are some who consider that the greatest scene in history, the hero sheathing his sword, after a life of spotless honor, a purity unreproached, a courage indomitable, and a consummate victory. A private citizen again, Washington returned quietly to his estate at Mount Vernon. But he could not remain there. The country needed him too badly, and his great work was yet to do. For let us remember that his great work was not the leading of the American army to victory, not the securing of independence, but the establishment of this republic. More than of any other man was this the work of Washington. He saw the feeble Confederation breaking to pieces, now that the stress of danger was removed. He beheld the warring interests and petty jealousies of statesmen who yet remained colonial. But he was determined that out of these 13 jarring colonies should come a nation, and when the convention to form a constitution met at Philadelphia, he presided over it. And it was his commanding will which brought a constitution out of a turmoil of selfish interests, through difficulties and past obstacles which would have discouraged any other man. And the Constitution once adopted, all men turned to Washington to start the new nation on her great voyage. Remember, there was no government, only some written pages saying that a government was to be. It was Washington who converted that idea into a reality, who brought that government into existence. It was a venture new to history, a republic founded upon principles which, however admirable in the abstract, had been declared impossible to embody in the life of a nation. And yet, 8 years later, when Washington retired from the presidency, he left behind him an effective government, with an established revenue, a high credit, a strong judiciary, a vigorous foreign policy, and an army which had repressed insurrections, and which already showed the beginnings of a truly national spirit. At the end of his second term as president, the country demanded that he accept a third. The country, without Washington at the head of it, seemed to many people like a ship on a dangerous sea without a pilot. But he had guided her past the greatest dangers, and he refused a third term, setting a precedent which no man in the country's history has been strong enough to disregard. In March, 1797, he was back again at Mount Vernon, a private citizen. He looked forward to and hoped for long years of quiet, but it was not to be. On December 12, 1799, he was caught by a rain and sleet storm while riding over his farm, and returned to the house chilled through. An illness followed, which developed into pneumonia, and 3 days later he was dead. He was buried at Mount Vernon, which has become one of the great shrines of America, and rightly so, for no man, at once so august and so lovable, has graced American history. Indeed, he stands among the greatest men of all history. There are few men with such a record of achievement, and fewer still who, at the end of a life so crowded and cast in such troubled places, can show a fame so free from spot, a character so unselfish and so pure. We know Washington to day as well as it is possible to know any man. We know him far better than the people of his own household knew him. Behind the silent and reserved man, of courteous and serious manner, which his world knew, we perceive the great nature, the warm heart, and the mighty will. We have his letters, his journals, his account books, and there remains no corner of his life hidden from us. There is none that needs to be. Think what that means! Not a single corner of his life that needs to be shadowed or passed over in silence. And the more we study it, the more we are impressed by it, and the greater grows our love and veneration for the man of whom were uttered the immortal words, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen," words whose truth grows more apparent with every passing year. Chapter 3 Recording by William Tomcho